Hi, everybody. Thanks, Robin. Welcome to our final EER seminar of the year. I'm Cindy Finelli. I direct our engineering education research program, and I'm really excited that we're anchoring our EER seminars this year with one of our own, Laura Hirshfield. She's going to be sharing some of the work that she's conducted as DEI lecturer at Michigan. And like the other seminars in our series this year, her presentation is really allowing us to showcase research about the experiences of minoritized engineering students. I'm really happy that we've had such a great community response to our seminars this year. So thank you everybody for helping make it such a success and for joining us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin Fowler. She's our EER seminar coordinator, and she'll do the formal introductions. So Robin?
I am excited to introduce a friend. Laura Hirshfield is a diversity, equity, and inclusion lecturer and an engineering education researcher here at University of Michigan. She's situated within chemical engineering. She obtained her BSc from U of M and her PhD from Purdue, both in chemical engineering, and then transitioned into EER with postdoc appointments at Oregon State, Olin College of Engineering, and here at U of M. Her engineering education research involves investigating how students become prepared for engineering practice through the development of skills such as creativity, communication, and teamwork, and also elements of affect, including confidence, sense of belonging, and sense of inclusion, with a focus on how this development might vary based on gender. Most recently, as one of the College of Engineering's first DEI lecturers, Laura has been utilizing her engineering education research skills to explore metrics that represent how the DEI climate is progressing in the College of Engineering, starting and running focus group program to gather feedback from students in every engineering department and program. And Laura, take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the informal and the formal introduction. So as Cindy mentioned, I'm going to try to open the chat. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on it, but we'll see how this goes. But as Cindy mentioned, I'm going to be talking today about my work done as a DEI lecturer over the past few years. And so generally what I'm going to be talking about is student perceptions of the climate at University of Michigan and the College of Engineering. And so I started in this position 3 years ago, so I'm just finishing my third year. And what I was tasked with when I started out was basically the second element of the DEI strategic plan. And so that being measuring our progress. And so what I've been working on is looking at different metrics to determine how the College of Engineering DEI strategic plan is progressing. And more specifically in the past couple of years, how students perceive the progress of the DEI strategic plan. And so U of M has specific DEI metrics set across the university. So it's things like demographic composition, considering that for the college at large, the university at large, and specific departments as well, or at the department level. And they also look at different climate indicators, and these are most often collected via climate surveys, like those that we do in the College of Engineering every couple of years. So this can be things like satisfaction with the climate or environment with regards to DEI, feeling valued, feeling like you belong, feeling like you're able to perform up to your full potential, and different things like this. And so in my role, trying to look at these specific metrics, I looked at a lot of different quantitative data at first. And then where I'll be focusing today specifically is looking at graduate students, demographic data. So most of the data I see is fall enrollment data, to answer Jennifer's question. So I don't see actually anything with regards to retention. I'll talk about student perceptions of retention. I won't talk about admissions. So I'll mostly be talking about like the current state and the state over the past 5 years in terms of numbers of demographics. So looking at that for grad students and also for undergrad students. And so very generally, I guess my methods for the project over the past 3 years. So I first looked at quantitative data and analyzed that. So this was all things that surveys that were completed before I even started in my position, looking at the College of Engineering climate surveys that I mentioned, and then also identifying different areas that have DEI related climate questions in them. So one survey I looked at a lot was the U of M Asks You survey. So it's called UMich. This is done across U of M and also at other institutions. So it can be used kind of as a metric to compare to how other universities are doing too. And then again, as I mentioned, looking at demographic data, which in the purposes of today will all be like fall enrollment data at the department level. And so after I did this in my first year, I looked at how these things differed across departments, across different identity groups of students. So kind of breaking down the data in a lot of different ways. I realized that there were a lot of differences between how students perceived climate based on the department they were in, or of course, based on their identity. And so some of these things were issues like maybe a very low satisfaction with overall climate in a specific department, or it could be a success, like a very consistent and high proportion of female students in a department. And so what we did next is we wanted to actually talk to students in every department and program to see why these differences might be. And so we held over the past 2 years, 30, I think it's maybe like 33 at this point. I had 2 this last weekend, 33 focus groups, and there were 230 plus undergrad and grad students. So we started with recruiting students from each program and department, both undergrad level and grad level. And then more recently, we've been trying to talk to students who are in identity-based organizations too. And so what we talked about in these focus groups was obviously the 3 elements of DEI. So student perceptions of diversity in the CUE and also in their department. We talked about equitable or inequitable treatment that they might experience. We talked about factors that they felt impacted their inclusion. And then I also asked department specific prompts that related to the findings from the quantitative data. And so before we really get into it, I want to talk about some limitations to this study and some caveats too. So I want to acknowledge the privilege I brought to the space, especially when I was talking to students in focus groups. So I'm a white woman. I think that most of the conversation, if we were talking about inequities, centered around the impact of on female students. And I feel like that is likely because I was a female moderator. I also recognize that depending on the student group, they either perceived me as a faculty member, which meant maybe sometimes there was varying levels of comfort with talking about things to a certain extent because they were worried about what I might do as a faculty member or how I might perceive them. Or students saw me as like some person in DEI at the COE and didn't really know who I was. And so both of those I feel like brought different ways that kind of students interacted with me. And so I want to acknowledge that. I want to say that I think generally students have a very positive perception of the efforts made around DEI in the College of Engineering. I think they recognize the fact that my position exists as a DEI lecturer, the fact that the college is supporting the focus group effort and plans to continue it in the future clearly means that there's interest in getting student voice, and students definitely recognize that. I also feel like the fact that the students had the ability to and interest in having these difficult conversations meant that DEI is definitely coming a long way. This is all to say a lot of things I was talking about today will be negative. It's not to say that I think every student in every focus group is saying they're having an awful time here, but this is a little intentional for a couple reasons. I mean, first of all, some of the focus groups like clearly became a context for students to vent, and I think that was fine because that was part of what I was trying to capture is things that are negatively impacting their experience. And so, of course, you know, humans talk about things that are negative a lot more than positive. So a lot of times the focus group discussion just skewed more negative, even if students, you know, really made it clear that they are having a really good experience here. But also, as Cindy mentioned, I really want to take today to amplify the voices of minoritized students specifically, and also students who are struggling in different ways. So just because everything I talk about today is mostly skewed negative does not mean that that's all we talked about in focus groups, or that that was, the complete view of the student perception. So with that said, shall we? So I kind of separated my talk into the 3 pieces, D, E, and I. It's obviously a little bit artificial in that all of these aspects are overlapping, but I felt like it was easier to kind of contextualize the data if we're considering it in these 3 ways. So first, talking about student perceptions of diversity. And so one of the questions I asked near the beginning of the focus group was, what is your perception of diversity in the College of Engineering? And there was a real range of responses. So it was obviously pretty variable by department. I say especially for grad students, because a lot of times grad students didn't even feel like they could speak to the College of Engineering at large. They feel very much like their community is their department. And so sometimes they didn't even feel like they could talk about the COE, because that's just not really the community in which they identify. And it also, of course, is really impacted by student identity. So I think underrepresented students had definitely more negative perception of diversity in the COE. And then some examples of responses. So in one way that a student identity kind of skews it in a different way. So comparing to their last school, the student said it's definitely more diverse than my old school. I'm not as frequently the only woman in the room, which is a really nice change. Another student said, in response to this question, they said, wanting, I feel like we're not a very equally represented group. They specifically pointed out that it's not really representative of the state of Michigan broadly, where we live. One theme that came up a lot is kind of the theme of tokenism. So when minoritized students were asked, what is your perception of diversity in the College of Engineering? This theme came up a lot, saying, I'd say enough to put on a poster and a brochure, meaning that there are female students, there are Black students that you can highlight on marketing materials to show that there's diversity, but maybe they don't feel like that's necessarily enough. And then this was the most extreme one that I have to laugh at. I would say abysmal. So it really varied. There are obviously positive perceptions outright that I didn't include on this slide, and then varying all the way down to say abysmal. But this is kind of the range of student perceptions of diversity. And so if we consider that in context of the numbers, so I'm only going to show undergrad demographics today, and that's for 2 reasons. One, there are a lot more grad programs, and it's a lot of lines, to be quite honest. And also, a lot of times the undergrad experience in a department kind of mirrors that of grad students. So I'm only showing undergrad students here, but I do have all of the grad data if anyone's interested in that specifically. So you can see that the proportion of female undergrad students in the COE has been pretty stagnant. It's been around 27 to 28 over the past years. Currently, it's at 28.3. And so something that was interesting that students talked about a lot is that, so if I probed them to talk specifically about demographics in terms of gender, race and ethnicity, or other identities, when talking about gender diversity, students didn't really feel that the College of Engineering is lacking in efforts to recruit women or retain women, but they kind of felt like the lower representation of women in the COE student body is more due to the entire field of engineering. And there are specific departments that kind of express this theme a lot more than others. And so one being Aero. So they noted that executive boards of companies and stuff are getting better, but there's a lot of white dudes. There's no representation of anybody else. So if you're looking for a role model, it's not going to be good. And then a student in NAME noted that maybe NAME is not as diverse as the rest of the university, but they feel like it's more diverse than industry. So when they go to a conference, they see a lot less women or people of color in comparison to their department. So if we're considering URM students, so this has been a more consistent increase in the College of Engineering, although still very low. So it's at 12.5 this year. And you can see Some departments are kind of consistently above that, and some departments are consistently more below. And if we look specifically at proportion of Black undergrad students, this is kind of a metric that's also been fairly stagnant. So it's been between about like 1.5 to 2.2 is at its peak over it's been for the past 5 years. Oh, and I also forgot to mention, so this is kind of the past 6 years. 2019 is missing from Tableau, I imagine possibly due to COVID. So it's over the last 5 years that were available to me, which is really over the last 6 years. And so if we're considering the relatively low number of Black students and also a relatively low number of female students, another theme that came up a lot was counting. So a lot of times students would either specifically count the number of female or Black students who were in their cohort or in a class, or they would talk about how that's often something that they do. So this computer engineering undergrad student talked about, I know lots of people who do this thing when you walk into a classroom, first day of lecture thing, you count how many women are in the room and think about the percentage and then sit there with that like, oh, that's pretty bad. And a lot of female students talked about doing this on the first day of class. And then this was a graduate student in a different department who did what I had mentioned, which was kind of like running through counting how many Black students there have been in the recent years, which was doable because there were so few. So as I had mentioned, students didn't really seem to feel like the COE was necessarily at blame for low recruitment or retention of female students. The language that they use implied that they feel that the climate in different departments or the COE broadly is more impactful on recruitment and retention of Black students. And so this is one example of an ME undergrad student who said, my engineering 100 group was me and 4 Black and Latino students. I looked all 4 up an community and they were not enrolled anymore. And I don't know, it just makes me think if we were all starting out with the same university resources, what gives? And then this other grad student in a different department said, one day we questioned the amount of African-American students that were applying to the program. And they said, oh, well, we invited what we got, but they're not applying to Michigan. But nothing has been done to encourage more students to apply to Michigan. So students feel like Michigan as a whole is not necessarily attracting Black students, but they also feel like the COE is maybe not retaining Black students. And so students also talked about kind of the self-perpetuating diversity or lack thereof. So students attributed the self-perpetuating diversity to existing demographics. So they felt like, for one thing, if there is a very diverse student body that will continue to attract a diverse student body, and we can see that in the proportion of students for female and Black students, a lot of the departments that have always been above COE average in those measures continue to be above COE measures. But they also felt like lack of diverse faculty will also influence the lack of diverse students. And so a lot of students kind of talked about this cycle where if students are coming to look at a program, how do you build a community if no one wants to commit without a community? So if you don't see yourself in the community there, that might mean people don't want to commit. As undergrad student in IOE, which does have a relatively higher proportion of female students, they said, I think this is why if there are more women in that room, obviously I find it a more comfortable room to be in. And then a CSE student pointed out, faculty can't hire women or URM faculty because they don't exist. And the people who do exist, no one's coming back to teach in CSE. So they were kind of talking about a lot, this was in context of a conversation of, they felt like a lot of women and URM students drop out of CS. And so how are we going to be able to get more faculty of these groups if we don't even have enough students that are in this group? And so also students perceive the faculty and staff population to be less diverse than the student population too. And so one undergrad student was talking about in their department in one of the first days of the year, they were talking about how the department is split very evenly between men and women, but there were only 4 male professors standing up saying, we have so many women in our department. And the student's like, I believe you, but this is not showing that. An undergrad student in a different department talked about, I feel like all of my professors and lecturers until next semester have been straight white males. So not great, referring to demographics of faculty. And so next, moving on to the E part of DEI, so talking about equity, so students' perceptions of what correlates to an equitable experience or an inequitable experience. And so this was kind of an interesting conversation because I would usually start out with asking students if they felt they were treated differently based on their identity. And pretty much across the board, students will say no. They will say, like, from faculty and from their peer students, they don't feel like they're treated differently based on their identity. But throughout the conversation, they would reveal a lot of ways that their identity might impact their experience. And so one student kind of recognized why this question is difficult for a student to answer is, if you're one of the people that's being treated differently, it's not like you notice. You're just used to always being treated differently, then you might not notice that other people are being treated better than you. And if you're one of the people that are being treated better, then obviously you're happy with that, and you don't notice that other people aren't being treated as well. So even though students kind of across the board said that they felt like they were being treated equitably, students kind of revealed that they feel like there's always potential for someone to judge them based on their identity. And so some ways that students kind of talked about this is there's always one person. It's always a person that because of who you are, your identity will not agree with you. And I feel like that's really hard to change from one person. I feel like it doesn't matter who you are there's always this person that will treat you differently. And if we were talking about this kind of treatment that students perceive they were treated differently, most often it came from their peers. And if we're talking about context, most often it seems like it was when students were working on team projects. So if students did talk about inequitable treatment from others or feeling like they were treated differently based on their identity, it very often came from their peers and very often came from the context of working on team projects. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a list that I felt like I had enough, student stories to kind of support. So even if students didn't necessarily say they were treated differently based on a certain aspect of their identity, these were a lot of the student identities that kind of themes emerged for inequities that they might experience. So ranging from, inequities based on their gender or based on their race or ethnicity, based on their citizenship, and then other kind of more nuanced things like lower socioeconomic status students, first-gen students, based on where a student was from. There was a lot of conversation about master's student experience compared to a PhD student experience, even though we often lump those together as a graduate student experience. Also talking with commuter students and students with families, and then LGBTQ plus students. And so I obviously don't have time today to talk about all of these. So I'm just going to highlight a few of the stories of students in these groups. And so I had mentioned earlier that I feel like in most conversation about inequitable experiences, it was with female students. And so female students, again, most often we're talking about how difficult it might be to work in a team project as a female. And so they discussed how they may experience issues with task choice or task delegation. So being delegated or expected to take on non-technical work by their peers, or being expected to kind of pick up slack from their peers. And if any of you have seen my work with Robin, you will see this completely mirrors what we found in our research looking at female student dissatisfaction on teams. Students also talked in the focus groups, especially about difficulties. It's not that they have more difficulties working with male teammates, but especially with male teammates that they don't know, so they maybe don't feel comfortable around. They perceive a lack of respect or trust from their male teammates, or sometimes from instructors or GSIs or IAs. There was a lot of discussion on romantic advances from male teammates or sometimes IAs. But a student experience that I felt like kind of brought a lot of this together was a civil environmental undergrad student talking about experiences with group work. So when you're working with all men, for example, they don't always take you seriously. Sometimes you have to be secretary and take notes or do menial tasks while they're doing all the work given. So this is definitely representing that first bullet. She mentioned there were 3 guys in my group and I was one of the girls. The 3 guys did not do anything ever. It was really bothersome. One of them actually went as far to delete the part of the spreadsheet we were using to organize work that had his name on it, as if we wouldn't notice that the task was missing. And she also mentioned later in the focus group that in this context, she was often called bossy by her male teammates. And so a lot of that is kind of representing all of these issues that female students might be experiencing in teams that we might not necessarily see. Students also talked about how their socioeconomic status could impact their experience here. And so one of those ways is students who are balancing their coursework with a job, especially working, 20 plus hours a week. They find it really difficult to balance that. And so one undergrad student said, "It's hard. I have to work more hours because I need money to survive. A lot of professors don't understand if I don't work, how am I going to eat this week? But I have to live every single day and my mom can't send me money, so I have to work." And so students talked especially about how working a job, working several hours a week can keep them from doing study groups, office hours, and things that would allow them to persist further in a class. So it's not only are they balancing it with homework and studying, but also they're losing out on opportunities because of their other commitments with their job. Students also talked about how hard it can be to relate to students of higher socioeconomic status who don't have the same worries that they do. So one grad student talked about, "It's so hard to have similar experiences when I'm helping my mom pay bills back home. And my advisors are like, why are you worried about the stipend?" And then students who also attended high schools that were of lower socioeconomic standing, that had less or no AP classes, have a lot harder time accessing courses here. So in one way, if you don't come in with AP credit, it can take you 5 years to finish, is what a computer engineering student said. So if you come from a high school that didn't teach calculus, you have to spend another year getting through intro math before you can even get to physics. But students also talked about how our registration system is built, whereas the more credits you have, the higher your ranking in registration. So students that came in with no or fewer AP credits are lower in the ranking and sometimes aren't even able to register for classes that are required. I also talked with first generation students. So one interesting story was about unspoken rules of academia. So a first generation PhD student said, "There's a lot of unspoken rules that I had to learn on my own. And some of these rules are like landmines. So when you step on them, here's all this collateral damage, and I've been scarred from that. It's unfortunate because grad school is already hard enough as it is." Oh, well, this is awesome. Okay, good news in the chat. Thank you to Corey and Susan and Kimberly. So that will no longer be an issue if I give this presentation in future years, at least. So first gen students also talked about how progressing in their classes can feel a lot harder without having academic support from their family. So one student talked about, "I can do the tests, I can get the answers, but there's something about being exposed to it and having a family member that comes home and says, I can help you with your math homework. That's critical to understanding some of this stuff." And so the last group I want to talk about in terms of inequities and experiences, international students. So international students seem to feel a lot more pressure in completing their degrees quickly, both at the undergrad and grad level. This seemed to have to do with the fact that they had to make a lot of life changes that are different than a domestic student to move here. They moved farther and moved out of their country. And also the fact that they're paying a lot more than domestic students. And so one undergrad student talked about, I'm thinking every day, is it worth it? I could graduate from school in my country, it's free. I could have $350,000 in my hand after graduation. What's best, come here or there? They said, I don't regret coming here. I'm not regretting it at all, but I feel like an outsider paying that much. And there's, of course, international students, especially in certain programs or departments, have a lot of additional barriers in finding jobs and funding. So a student talked about, a lot of my American friends, they can graduate with a master's and then find a good paying job. For international students, they can't do that, especially if they already have a master's degree coming in. Their visa requirement and the paperwork involved with everything, finding a new advisor, a lot of times this means you have to go home. And so the last thing I'll talk about is the I part of DEI, so inclusion. I feel like most of the conversation that we had in these focus groups was about different factors that are impacting inclusion. And so this is like so not exhaustive what I'm about to talk about, but I kind of just picked the topics that felt most pervasive and they seemed to come up the most. And so generally summarizing themes that came up a lot when talking about inclusion. So as I mentioned, there is a lot of positive conversation in these focus groups, although I'm not highlighting it as much today, but things that have a lot more positive impact. A lot of students praised, undergraduate students praised their Engineering 100 experience for kind of setting the tone for creating a lot of community as they started here in the COE. There was a lot of conversation about physical space that I guess for some reason surprised me how much that can impact how a student feels included. So students who are in newer or renovated buildings, Gigi Brown came up a lot, talk about how they like to spend time in those buildings. So if they're meeting up with students to study together or meeting up with project teams, they're going to choose to, work at that building rather than a place on Central that might be a little bit closer to where they actually live. And so feeling like they have this home base really contributes positively to their sense of inclusion. Similarly, common areas for students. Students talk a lot about liking to be able to walk into a room and find anyone who's working on the same homework that they are, or that they can eat lunch with or have a conversation about research with. Also, strangely, this is what I did not expect, and it might surprise any of you who are here at U of M in the COE. Students really seem to feel like the College of Engineering being separate from Central Campus physically really positively impacted their inclusion. So they mentioned the bus a lot and how, you see people on the bus with you on the same route every week and you can make a lot of connections with people that way. They like that generally a student that you're going to be seeing on the North Campus diag will be from engineering. And so they like having that community, that it's really easy to tell who your peers are. Students also talked about participation in a few different activities that really had a positive impact on their inclusion. So one being participation in research, especially undergrad students really praised having the opportunity to do this here. Participation in campus jobs. So this is jobs that, were directly linked to their department or the College of Engineering. So like being a tutor or being an IA or being a tour guide or working through the Engineering Advising Center, things like that. Also participation in student organizations, especially identity-based student orgs and also co-curricular project teams. Students also really praised smaller departments for positively impacting their inclusion. And we talked a lot about inclusive teaching, but I think the thing that came up the most is just having an instructor that they felt like really cared about them and how much that, just feeling like you have someone that really cares about you and your success, how much that can really positively impact your sense of inclusion. And so things that had a little bit more of a negative impact, other elements of physical space. So kind of the opposite, unrenovated buildings. So buildings that students didn't necessarily want to seek out to spend time in, that can make them feel like they don't have a home base for their department or students that are in their program. There was a lot of discussion of lack of gender neutral or women's restrooms. This is quite obvious in some of the older buildings on North Campus is sometimes there might be only one women's restroom or very few. Or I think the most surprising one to me is the one that's in, I had to go check this out after students talked about it in a focus group, but the female restroom on the first floor of the NERS building, which was clearly a closet before, it has like a very narrow door. And also some ways that, of course, College of Engineering being separate from Central can negatively impact their experience. And that was mostly just it being separate from where most students are living. And so it being a little bit more difficult to actually get up to campus and get up to class. Participation in campus jobs, as I mentioned, was a positive impact on inclusion, but when students are working a certain number of hours a week that are keeping them from social or academic experiences that other students are having, that can negatively impact inclusion. A general lack of diversity, as we kind of saw earlier in my talk, negatively impacts inclusion. Grind culture is something I'll talk more about today. Poor mental health, which I think is related to grind culture. And so first, before I talk about some of the findings in the focus group in more detail, I think it was really interesting that when I first started here, I looked at a lot of correlations in department data. And so things that correlated, they might be statements on UMich surveys, or they might be demographic data. But some of the statistically significant correlations that I found, students agreeing with the fact that U of M is a welcoming campus had a positive correlation with quality of teaching by GSIs. So as we saw on the previous slide, so caring instructors really influences a student's sense of inclusion. So that's kind of what is seen here. But things that negatively correlate in a statistically significant way is different demographic status. So proportion of URM students, proportion of Black students, and also change in proportion of URM students over time. So if students in a department are more likely to agree with this statement, that means that they're less likely to have a higher proportion of URM or Black students, or to be increasing in proportion of URM students over time. And so another correlation I looked at was with this statement: knowing what I know now, I would still choose to enroll at this campus. So basically level of agreement with this statement. So there were positive correlations with a lot of the things that have to do with smaller departments that I mentioned, which is a positive impact on student inclusion. So access to faculty outside of class, access to small classes, both positively, significantly correlate. Also, I mentioned students love having the opportunity to do research, which is seen here. But also, as I mentioned, students working jobs really keeps them from being able to participate fully in their experience here. And that's represented here with this significant negative correlation between agreement with this statement and working 21 or more hours a week in a job. And so if we consider how students talked about inclusion in the focus groups, students really reported not feeling excluded in the COE. So they don't feel like there's anything happening in the College of Engineering that makes them feel excluded, which kind of mirrors how they talked about. They don't feel like they're typically treated inequitably by other members, but they also noted that they don't necessarily, that doesn't mean that they feel included. And this most often, students that talked in this way, it was due to a lack of diverse population or lack of representation of their identity. So one grad student talking about, it's not super diverse. It makes it hard to find a comfortable community. People are super welcoming and super friendly, but it's nice having people that you identify with. And another student, an undergrad, said, in a lot of spaces, it's hard to feel like you belong because you don't often see yourself when you look into these faces. It's multi-level, goes beyond gender and race. It can be things like socioeconomic status or how well you did in your classes your freshman year. So all of these intersections of identity definitely influence how a student might feel included or feel like they don't belong. And so we didn't talk that much about U of M broadly. We talked about College of Engineering community and then community within their own department. But whenever students did talk about U of M, they associated it with kind of feeling like a number. So they would talk about how they generally don't feel like they belong within the broad community of U of M. So this can be things like, it seems like Michigan in general doesn't care about you as a student, so that makes me feel less like I'm a part of the Michigan atmosphere, but I'm not, because they really don't care if I'm here or not. I'm just a number. Another student, a grad student, talked about, I felt like in my first 2 years, there was huge pressure to just stay, just stick it out. And it felt like you just wanted me to be here to be a number. It was like, you are a Michigan engineer, but there wasn't as much focus on how can I succeed as a Michigan engineer. And so it definitely came out that students find a lot more belonging when they're forming these smaller communities. So they're finding belonging in these smaller communities contributes to a general higher sense of belonging. And so as one student kind of described this as saying, oh, I'm a part of engineering, they don't really feel that, but they do feel like, oh, I'm a part of a department. We have our professors and our friends and stuff, but there's never really been a point where I felt like I belonged in it. And so in these kind of micro communities, for grad students, this was most often things like research groups. So one student saying, I feel like I belong in my lab. That's the way I justify it to myself. I guess I was accepted here for a reason. I fit that reason, and my reason is to be in this lab. That is where I fit, and that is where I belong. And for grad students, it can also be, they talked a lot about feeling more sense of belonging in smaller programs or departments. And so one student who's in the macro program said, this program is so small, it's quite tight-knit. You feel like you matter and you aren't just another student. And because it's a strong community around that crowd, you feel included, which is really nice. And for undergrad students, they talked a lot about identity-based student orgs. So one student saying, I'm part of the Hispanic engineering group in the college. It's easy for me to connect with people that are like me. But then once you're away from groups that you identify with, you feel really isolated. Undergrad students also talked about a higher sense of belonging in smaller departments, as we saw in the quantitative data that I talked about before. So a student in NERS saying, if you find your niche, the COE is very inclusive and you feel like you belong. We all found a tiny department, but not everyone has that. And a student in class said it helps that it's small. Professors know you on a personal level. They see you. They know who you are. They're willing to help you out whenever you need it. Hey, you need research. Hey, you need a letter of rec. Let me help you with your job application. And for undergrads, this was something that surprised me, is that students talked a lot about finding more belonging in departments that they chose before coming to U of M. And so one example of this was aero. Like a lot of students who come here wanting to do aero, they do aero. And so students describe this as saying, we're all space nerds. Everyone has a NASA tag on their backpack. It's like we're more of a family than other majors because we all have a very specific passion that might not exist with other majors. And so one thing I mentioned before is how caring instructors can really positively impact sense of inclusion. And so this was not often like specific inclusive teaching strategies, but two things most of all. So one, being really invested in student success. So students really feeling like their instructors cared about what they were going to be doing really positively impacted their sense of inclusion. And also having the ability to convey difficult material. This came up a lot more than I was expecting. And so students, I think, really perceive that if a professor is able to kind of know that it's really difficult for students to learn that, and they're able to break it down at a level where it's something we can understand, as the student said here, they really feel like that is one of the core things of inclusive teaching that helps them feel like they belong more. And this next slide is my longest quote. I'm going to let you all read it, but I just thought the way this student described how struggling in a course can really reduce sense of inclusion, especially if you're already underrepresented in the classroom. I just thought the way that they described this was so interesting. So I'm going to show the quote and then just give you a couple minutes to read it. So yeah, I thought this student just did like a brilliant job of describing how if you're struggling in a class and you also don't see yourself in that class, how, I mean, I can still hear the students say that phrase, "Oh man, is that thing going to flourish?" Something else that came up a lot is how the challenge of the College of Engineering creates a lot of community. So students mentioned how they find community with each other by struggling together. So one student saying, "I see my friends also struggling and we'll just hang out, study together, and I feel like I'm not alone." Another student saying, "I feel like there's a sense of camaraderie. Everyone's in the same boat, struggling. It's kind of nice that everyone's focused on their education, wanting to be successful." But this mindset can obviously also be very damaging. And so this is where I'll talk a little bit about grind culture and how elements of that impact students. So this student was in response to this student mentioning this here. So their response was, "The fact that everyone's struggling together also makes an atmosphere where everyone has to struggle, or you're expected to be struggling at all times, and I don't really like that." So on this slide, I have a content warning. So if, especially in the context of everything that's been happening this week and the past few days, I want to give you a chance to mute me and look away if gun violence would be especially upsetting to you right now. And then you can kind of, bounce back in 60 seconds when I'm done with this slide. But grind culture, which was definitely talked about in some departments more than others, but it was really clear how this can be damaging to mental health, kind of balanced work-life balance, and also student success. And so one element of that kind of came out in the focus groups was students feeling like their work is more important than themselves. And so this was an example of a CS grad student who said they were working in the fishbowl when there might have been an active shooter a few years ago. I don't know if anyone else remembers that, but they realized that it actually was balloons popping. But the student said, "When I found out there might be an active shooter nearby, the first thing I did was saved my code and pushed it to Git. I didn't run. I literally pushed my code to Git. I thought it was fine." And I was like, "Oh yeah, I pushed to Git. Isn't that hilarious?" It was funny. And the only reason I realized it was wrong was my mom almost cried. She was so mad at me. I didn't save myself. Sorry, it's obviously like really upsetting to see this in our students, but the fact that this student chose to save her code instead of save herself in this situation is like, I think she didn't even realize how upsetting it was until, as she mentioned, she talked to her mom, and then again when she was talking in the focus group about it. And so grind culture can also be pervasive in a way that it leads to a lack of balance if we're talking about work-life balance. And so students talked a lot about if you want good grades, you have to use all the resources available to you. And with that, it's really difficult to balance anything else in life, whether it's family, relationships, a job. You can't work and study here. You have to put your all into school if you want to do well. Otherwise, it all comes falling down. So another student talked about, you might want to go out on a weekend with your friends, but you can't because you literally have so much you have to do and so much you have to keep up with. Another element of grind culture, and I feel like this was more prevalent in the conversations with graduate students, was the glorification of busyness. So this is things like, it feels like you're doing something wrong if you're not doing something all the time. If you have free time, you feel like you're missing something. I should work on this project that's due in 2 months. Students said it's glamorized if you stay really late or if you come in really early or if you have a horrible work-life balance. It's almost like people are proud of it. To say that they stayed here until 2 a.m., it's like a sign of pride. And then one final aspect of grind culture students talked about a lot is perceiving that they don't have support from their instructors. And so this is the student who talked about the active shooter experience before. She was saying, looking back on it, I think if I had actually talked to someone, yeah, I was in an active shooter situation, I had to get out, I didn't save my stuff, can I have an extension? Someone on the staff would have cared. But in general, there have been stories of, for example, someone's house literally caught fire. Their computer was in there and they were like, I need an extension, and we gave them 2 days. I think that's what it ended up being. That's not enough time. So students worry that even if they are inexperienced, that they really need to take extra time to complete an assignment. They really worry that if they ask they'll be told no. And so a lot of these things clearly can lead to poor mental health, among other factors. One of the, I will remember this quote for the rest of my life. A lot of grad students are depressed, and all that depression in one room, everyone just becomes more depressed, and there needs to be more outlets. I think part of the department is like, it's your personal life. You need to take charge of that, but we're already taking charge of the other aspects of our life. I feel like if we've ever seen grad school summed up in 2 sentences, it's those first 2 sentences there. But clinical depression is such a pervasive issue with graduate students and with our undergrad students. And so the fact that students are struggling this much obviously means that they aren't able to succeed in the way that we want them to. And so it's kind of more than just this poor mental health that's impacting student success. So again, a content warning for this slide, discussion of suicide. So look away and mute me for a minute if that would be triggering to you. So students also, of course, when talking about mental health, I would ask about, well, what is your perception of U of M and how it cares about your mental health? And they generally perceive a lack of mental health support across U of M. And so it's not only that, of course, if they're struggling mentally, they're going to have a difficult time in their classes, but also this perceived lack of support really impacts students too. And so one student talked about, I did not feel like I was comfortable enough to tell a professor, hey, I can't take this midterm today because, I'm suicidal and I literally can't do it. So instead of asking, I just felt like it was going to be a no. So I went and took the exam anyway, and I failed it. Another student said, it's really difficult to talk to teachers about it. Some of them, you feel like they won't listen, doesn't make a difference. It's not something you can prove. You don't have a doctor's note to be like, hi, I'm sick. My freshman year, my dad got diagnosed with cancer, and I felt like there was nothing I could do. I couldn't talk to any of my professors about it and be like, this is what I'm going through. And the one professor I did wasn't asked about it. So I just didn't want to do it anymore. So it's not great. So it's not only that students are struggling with mental health, but they worry that if they do reach out, they might not get the support that they need. And sometimes when students do reach out, they don't get the support that they need. And so this obviously really negatively impacts the student experience. And so, as I mentioned, I could talk about this forever. I'm happy to answer any specific questions if you have questions about, other topics that students might have discussed in the focus group. I realized this morning, on my draft of my talk, I had 123 slides. So that's how many important things I think were in these focus groups. And, I had to bring it down to 48 slides for today. So where do we go from here? I think the focus groups revealed so many important things. I think some of them were things that we know anecdotally, but now we have the data to kind of back that up. But it also revealed that we definitely need to be doing this more often. So as I mentioned, there is intention to continue the focus groups, not every year, but maybe every few years, especially kind of rotating it with other ways that departments are collecting student data. And so I'm really glad that, I was able to do this over the last couple of years and reveal all of these student experiences and amplify their voices as much as I could. And at this time, I know we don't have that long, but I'll take at least the next 4 minutes for questions. And thank you so much for attending today too. Thank you.
People can put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. Also clapping, yep, agreed. Yay!
Thank you, everyone.
Laura, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you remember the slide that had, and now lots of them are coming in. I will hold mine, and if we end up with lots of extra time, I'll ask it, or I'll just bug you later.
Okay, yeah. So Jennifer's question, where does this information go in U of M? So I wrote reports for each department at the undergrad and the grad level. The grad reports were distributed over last year. And then I had meetings with leadership in every department to kind of talk through all of those. And then I am doing the same with the undergrad reports now, although we won't be doing meetings unless they're asked. So all the undergrad reports are done and will be going out to departments over the next month. So that's all of the department level data, and I think we're still figuring out how all of this more general data that I talked about today will be distributed, but it might just be literally distributing the slide deck from today. And James' question, based on student input, what institutional changes do you think would have the greatest impact? I mean, there's a reason I left off with the mental health aspect, because I think that I do feel like the COE and U of M has done so much to address mental health in the past few years, but it's clearly not quite enough still. And it's going to continue to be a pervasive issue. And I think especially this last year, it was even more difficult than ever before. So I feel like a focus on better support for mental health would be one of the biggest things. Erica's question, is there a report about faculty and how to influence them to adopt best practices for DEI? So in each of the department reports, there are action items at the end. So kind of like suggestions for what department leadership and faculty could do to kind of help address a lot of the issues that I might have highlighted, or to perpetuate a lot of the successes. I do not have access to academic support, Jennifer, and the question you asked previously kind of made me feel like I would really love to see some of that data too. So I definitely appreciate you reaching out if you are a person who can help me with that. Susan's question, so I mean, long story short, I didn't build enough rapport trust with them. And I think this was actually more, so these were held over the last semester where I reached out to student organizations, identity-based student orgs, to talk with them more. I went through Mariah Fumara because she has great connections with all the student orgs. And so she helped me with recruitment, but it just never, we didn't get that many numbers in those groups. And so I mean, it could have been that I'm an unknown quantity that they don't necessarily trust. I feel like it also could have been the fact that like students are so exhausted, especially this semester. I'm exhausted. We're all exhausted this semester. So I almost feel like that maybe was part of it too. So I didn't talk to as many identity-based groups as I would have liked to, but I hope that can be a bigger part of it moving forward. Joey, is it possible for department data to also be sent to department grad and undergrad councils and societies? I need to look into plans for like how I personally could disseminate this data, but for now, if you reached out to your DEI lead, they would be able to give you access to the report if you're interested. I don't know if I need to pause because it's 4:30, but I'm happy to just keep going.
Just keep going. People will go away if they need to.
Okay, but if you are leaving now, thank you so much for attending, but I will keep addressing questions. Yeah, thank you. Susan.
Can I chime in quick? Should we transition to our sort of open discussion time where we convert everybody to panelists, and then we can just continue to have Laura answer questions, but we can have a more organic discussion?